Welcome, folks. So we're going to be doing chapter 9 today. What do you have any questions from last chapter that we need clarified?
My only thing was the beginning unit quiz didn't open up for me, so I still wasn't able to take that for 9.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, I'll reopen that. I apologize.
Okay, no worries. Thanks.
Other questions? Awesome. Well, we are going to just dive right into chapter 10 material. Okay, the aorist tense. So we're picking up a new tense today. Actually, 2, in fact. We're doing both the aorist and the future. But what we're going to learn very quickly is that it's not really as difficult as what it kind of looks. So dive right in. We've talked about building verbs and how we have a stem, and sometimes a prefix is going to get added to the front. Sometimes we'll have a tense indicator and or coupling vowel and an ending. Up until this point, largely we've used long labels with like primary active, primary middle passive, which is the same as like type 1, type 3. Or imperfect, where we use secondary active, secondary middle passive, which is type 2 or type 4. That's going to hopefully pay off a little bit here soon, because now those labels are hopefully will kind of pay off for us. But you can see I've laid out in this chart for the present imperfect, and as we add things, we're just going to basically be growing this chart. I want to talk briefly about connecting vowels, though. I had mentioned previously that with connecting vowels, with the type 1 endings, the type 1 endings, the connecting vowels had merged with other vowels, and you'll never see them separate. And so they were there, but they weren't obvious necessarily. And then for type 3, I said you could kind of see the connecting vowels a little bit better, but not always. That second person singular amalgamates and becomes an eta. But when we go to type 2, type 4, I pointed out that we always see those connecting vowels. If you remember that, we always saw that epsilon, we always saw that omicron. And it's going to matter now because basically, welcome Wes, basically what's going to end up happening is those, even though we have the same, the aorist, for example, is going to take the type 2, type 4 endings, the actual connecting vowel is going to change. And so that's the significance of what we're doing. So let's take a look at the, so far the paradigms that we've memorized have been memorized with the connecting vowels. Okay. And for example, see the secondary endings for the omicron epsilon connecting vowel. So if you look at column 2 for omicron epsilon at plus ending, that should look familiar. On, s, and omen, eta, own. The actual endings there are nu, sigma, a movable nu, men, te, and nu, that first column. Is what that vowel all the way down is the connecting vowel. What we're going to find is some tenses will change the connecting vowel. So it's still the same ending, but just there's a different vowel. And so, or most of the time it's a different ending. We do have an exception or two. So if you jump over to the AE, the alpha epsilon endings, the last column, instead of own, we're just going to get alpha, which is the weird one in that first singular. And then we'll have os. So s gets replaced with os. N stays the same. Omen goes to amen. Eta goes to ata. On goes to on. So again, the endings are still the same. Pay attention to that, all except that first singular. But the connecting vowels are changing. And this will basically happen in 2 of our tenses throughout the semester, or throughout the months of the semester, I guess. Does that make sense? So what does that look like? So here's our new chart. The 2 things we're adding are the future and the aorist. For the future, it's I have the stem with an asterisk there. Both the stem and the aorist in the future are going to potentially go through stem changes. We'll learn about that here in a day or so. But for right now, what we need to pay attention to is a future is going to get marked, and we talked about this yesterday. It's going to have it'll have a sigma in between the stem and the ending. And so previously it was primary active, primary middle, passive. Now it's just primary active, primary middle. And then the passive is, we'll learn that later. The passive doesn't go through the same, it doesn't take the same ending. But for us, so what this, equates to is that for active, it takes a type 1. For middle, it takes a type 3. And for future, it'll actually take a different ending. So we'll talk about that. And then the aorist, what we actually see is that the aorist is going to get an epsilon augment on the front. It'll have it has a stem which may or may not go through a stem change, and we'll talk about that in a chapter or so. And then over here for the indicator, it takes a sigma, much like the future, only it's going to have an alpha epsilon connecting vowel, and that's what I've denoted here with the alpha / epsilon. It won't look like that. It'll be either the sigma alpha or the sigma epsilon, and we'll talk about, we'll do some examples at the end of the PowerPoint to kind of see this. And then for endings, when it's active, it'll take type 2 endings, which are the secondary active endings. When it is middle, it'll take type 4 endings. Okay. Secondary middle, we do not have the passive yet, and so we'll pick up the passive later. Actually, at the very end of the class, we'll pick up the passive for aorist. So the aorist commonly, in the future rarely, will have a stem change for specific verbs. For the aorist, these verbs are called second aorist verbs, and they'll need to be memorized as such. We'll cover this next day, tomorrow. What I will say is that they are like that. There's some memorization work there with second aorist verbs. Like, you're just not going to get around it. It's going to be a lot of work. We don't need to worry about that now because we're not dealing with those today. But tomorrow, just know that there's going to be some work. Okay, so what does this look like? So for the future, I've taken Pistevo and just shown what the future looks like. For the active future, you'll have that Pistev stem. You have the type 1 endings that you've come to know, omega, O, E, omen, eta, usin. I've highlighted in blue where you can see the connecting vowel, like kind of the raw connecting vowel in the type 1 ending. You'll never see this. Like, it'll never matter, but I'm wanting to highlight it to you because I'm sensitizing it to you this today in this lecture. And then the other thing that's been added is a sigma in between the stem and the ending. So again, diagnosing verbs are going to be like a little bit of forensic analysis. You're just going to have to go and kind of dissect things and figure out what's what and look for clues basically as to what you're looking at. For the middle, the future middle, so I took Pistev again, and I just showed what this looks like for the future, which is you take the type 3 endings that we've come to know, and it's just all the type 3 endings with a sigma. Again, I've underlined and highlighted that connecting vowel. Again, it's never going to actually matter, okay? But it is, but I want you to see them. I want you to begin to see these now. Because for type 2, type 4, it will matter. So, we're big kids now in Greek, so we can begin to kind of see some of this and see the continuity. So, okay, so that's the future. For the future, it's most commonly it's going to be predictive, meaning that it's just going to be how we use the future. They're going to state. It'll state what the speaker believes will happen in the future, and she will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus. In the indicative future, it's no one knows the future, but it's what people believe is factual. It's what people believe will happen in the future. And then the rest of these uses of the future are just super rare. Long just mentions them, and so I'll mention them, but don't stress too much about them. One of these is the gnomic rare, or the gnomic future, sorry, which is very rare and indicates the likelihood of a general event happening. And Paul uses Roman for scarcely would someone die for a righteous person. Like, somebody could in the future die, but, and so he's talking about the possibility here of that happening. There's also the imperatival future. It's very rare. It's used like a command. Mostly it happens in the Septuagint, which is our Greek Old Testament. We don't see it a lot in the New Testament. It's already rare, and then I don't know if there are, obviously there is one occurrence here. We have this Matthew 5, but oftentimes it's just not present in the New Testament. And so this 548, any of you that took Matthew IBS, I'm familiar with this. Therefore, you be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The future, but it's being used almost like an imperative. Deliberative, it's very rare. It asks a question that implies some doubt about the response. So from Mark 6, should we buy 200 denarii of bread, and will we give it to them to eat? So they're deliberating on kind of a will we, won't we? And sometimes just the raw future tense is used to this. You know, and if you translate it normally, it's going to be like, will we buy 200 denarii of bread, and will we give it to them to eat? So you can kind of get the sense of it, translating it, you know, straight, but still, you know, it's again, it's very unusual, very rare, but Long mentions it, so I'm mentioning it. So the active aorist and the active middle formation. Sorry. So the active, the aorist active is this first slide. I don't know why it says middle. Ignore that. The active formation, add an augment to the front, just like we did with the imperfect. Add a sigma tense indicator is added to the stem with an alpha epsilon connecting vowel and secondary endings. So you see pistev, we've taken that. So we have the epsilon at the front, pistev, and then basically all the way down, you see that sa. The sigma is what's been added, but so has this connecting vowel. And so the only exception to it being that third person singular. And so you end up having like sa, se, samen, sate, san. So Long says that the entire ending like is sa. The entire ending is sas. The entire ending is sen. And technically that's actually not correct. And that's what I'm wanting to try to sensitize us to. What the ending is still the same functionally. What's actually happened, you know how when I brought this chart up like way back in the beginning, right here, and I said that this becomes alpha right here, this technically isn't even correct, because what's happening is this nu is disappearing, and this is just the naked connecting vowel. You see that? So to go back down here, nope, that's not what I want. Nope, sorry. That's what I get for jumping around. Okay. So that alpha is the connecting vowel, just like the alpha in the next one and in all of the plurals are the connecting vowel. So the endings are basically the same as the other type 2 endings that we have, but our connecting vowel has changed and a sigma has been added. You can memorize this as a separate set of endings, okay? You know, Long suggests that. He puts the chart and he says, memorize this chart. I don't think you need to, as long as you understand what's going on. And that's part of, like, I want you to memorize the absolute minimum necessary. Like, that's always been my goal. And so if you wanted to memorize this as a separate chart, do that. You know, that's fine. But the reality is that that alpha is just simply the connecting vowel. It's an alpha epsilon connecting vowel. That sigma is just the tense indicator that's been added. And then we have basically the endings that are the same endings, except for one where the ending is dropped out. Questions? Okay. So the middle formation, as with the secondary endings, so we see these type 4 endings, basically, the main, o, to, metha, sam, sastha, and into. But basically, they've been added, those connecting vowels, that second person singular is still kind of weird. It just goes to so. But, you know, that kind of, on one hand, looks like a first person singular future. But that epsilon at the front is cluing you off that that is indeed not a future. And so that's why what we're going to do is you often start at the ending to get an idea of what type of ending it is, and then you're going to work backwards. Like, or oftentimes, either I'll work backwards or I'll start at the ending and then I'll jump to the front to see if I have or any of the prefixes. So oftentimes I'll start on the ends of the verb and then I'll go to the middle to see what the tense indicators are communicating. Oftentimes you may only have 2 of the 3 elements that are here. It's like something's amalgamated or disappeared or something's weird. And so, again, you're going to just have to take your best guess based on the evidence that you do have. And we'll do some examples of these just so you guys get a feel for this. And I'm going to show you. Have you guys? Was the cheat sheet, the paradigm sheet that you guys have been using for the midterm, has that been helpful? Okay. So we're gonna be swapping to the new one for the final, and I'll maybe bring that up after this lecture just so that I can point out how it works. Okay, because there's a bunch of charts on there that you don't have to memorize, like you're never gonna have to reproduce for the class, but it's actually the way that I've designed them is they're a diagnostic tool, and so what you can do is you can take bits of evidence and use those evidence from the verb you're looking at to narrow down the possibilities. And so I'll show you that when we wrap up here. When we wrap up for the lecture. Okay, so the aorist usage. Long lists a bunch of these. You're basically never going to have to know any of these. These are just simply for, like, you will have to know these the farther you go into Greek, but for right now, it's just a simple past. And that's what Long calls the constative, which is used for past action viewed as a whole. And we've talked about that. It's like basically in English, it's the equivalent of putting an ED on the end of a verb. And then the ingressive or inceptive, it's also fairly common, used to stress the beginning of an action or entrance into a state of being. The consumptive, used to stress the cessation of an act or state. And then a bunch of rarers, the gnomic, the epistolary, proleptic, and the immediate or dramatic. I've linked Wallace. I've showed you guys, I put Wallace's page numbers on all these if you want to read a little bit more. I have a bunch. Long doesn't give any examples of these. But if you go to Wallace, he gives kind of robust examples of how each of these are functioning if you're wanting to kind of see the range of the aorist. As a reminder, the aorist is the second most common tense. It's up there with the present. So you're going to see aorist a whole bunch, over 10,000 occurrences. So get used to it. So when you add a sigma, sigma is one of those slippery letters. You know, we've talked about how, like, I've talked about, like, in chemistry, you have elements that are reactive. Sigma is one of those reactive things. When it bumps up against certain letters, it creates other letters, or literally drops out. So with labials, which are your P, your beta, and your phi, when the sigma impacts those, it becomes a psi. With dentals, when you have a tav, a delta, a theta, or a zeta, which is basically all of the letters that you're putting your tongue behind your teeth to say, the dentals, when you add a sigma to that, they all become sigma, so they drop out. This is why baptizo, do you remember that zeta dropped out and we only had a sigma sitting there? It's because the stem ended with zeta, and so the zeta dropped out and the sigma stayed. The palatals are stems ending in kappa, gamma, or chi, but when the sigma impacts them, you get a C. And finally, stems ending with lambda, mu, nu, or rho, when a sigma impacts them, the sigma disappears. So what you'll have to depend on when that sigma disappears is you're going to have to depend on the other tense, the other indicators that you're dealing with the tense. So, for example, let's say the stem ended in one of those letters and the sigma has dropped out. How do you tell the difference between that and an imperfect? Because they're both going to have an epsilon augment, right, on the front, and the sigma is no longer there. What might clue you off of the difference between the imperfect and the aorist at that point?
Will the connecting vowel be different?
The connecting vowel will be different, absolutely. So you'll still have that alpha. Normally, let me say it this way, normally the connecting vowel is going to be, remember there's that third person singular where you have an epsilon connecting vowel in the aorist. So sometimes you do have an epsilon. So it will probably be different is the answer. Is there another way that you might figure that out? The ending will also be, no, I'm lying to you. The ending won't be different. It's the connecting vowel. Yep, it's the connecting vowel. That's the only one. Okay, so that's the aorist and the future in a nutshell. What we'll do is we'll look at vocab real quick, and then we'll do some exercises. Oh, no, never mind. I'm lying to you. Okay, We still have a little bit more lecture. So a new go. What I've done is I've taken the base verb and shown you what it looks like when it goes into a third plural aorist and a third future plural. And so you see a new go. You see that root stays the same. The epsilon impacts the front, like it did with the imperfect, and creates that eta. You see that? The gamma impacts the sigma, and that becomes a xi, and then you have the alpha nu ending. So as you can tell, like, stuff will sometimes change, sometimes a lot. And we just need to pay attention to this. And then for when it goes to the future, you see that gamma impacts the sigma and becomes a xi, a nux, and then it just has the normal type 3 plural usine ending. Do we see that? And then you can go back down, go back through. You see pitho, epsilon. When that sigma hits that theta, the theta drops out and the sigma stays. And then in the future, the same thing. The theta drops out, the sigma stays, and you get the usine ending. Gropso, that phi is going to get become C as a normal ending with that augment. Again, so the big changes that you're going to be looking for is basically occasionally on the front, if it starts with a vowel, you're going to go through that vowel will lengthen to like an eta, as we've seen, or an omega. And then occasionally the end of the stem may change very slightly as that sigma interacts with it. But as you'll see, what's consistent there is that alpha connecting vowel. So even if there's a stem, so what you'll often do is you'll look at the ending and go, new, that's probably a type 2 ending. And then you're going to look and see that alpha and go, okay, well, that's an A-class connecting vowel. So do I possibly have a sigma or here, or does something happen to the sigma? So you'll go back the next letter and see like C. And you'll know, okay, the sigma, an S sound, is in a C. So it may have amalgamated with the stem, that type of thing. And so this, I mean, it's really going to be like a game of Clue, basically, trying to figure out what some of these verbs are doing. Okay. Questions? So we're going to move on to another verb that's irregular. It's yuda. Yuda is technically in the perfect tense. We haven't learned the perfect yet. We'll learn it later. But Long is introducing it now. Yuda it's like imi in that you have to memorize it separately. This is not something you're going to be able to kind of discern normally. But if you'll look, the ending should look pretty familiar, right? Like those endings for Yuda look like an aorist, no sigma ending, like an aorist ending with no sigma, or very close to it at least. You know, so this is the verb to know. I've spelled distinctives wrong. That's awesome. Oh, no, distinctives. It's staying distinctives. To complicate things further, like I said, so it's technically in the perfect, but it's using the same endings as the aorist with no sigma tense modifier. And it's going to be frequently followed by the conjunction hoti, which marks the start of a content clause. We've learned hoti, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to get translated as like that. Like, you know that, I know that, we know that. And so that hoti is going to show up and mark a content, basically. Technically, it can be identified as either indirect discourse or indirect discourse or a content. Because that's both of those are doing the same thing. Is they're telling you the contents of whatever the verbal knowing is. So this is just something you're going to have to memorize, but just so again, it's perfect, but it's going to look like an aorist. So because it looks like an aorist, Long is covering it now. Because it could confuse you, it could trip you up, which is why he wants you to lump it in with the aorist, so that when you do see it, you know that it's not aorist. I know that sounds silly, but there is some logic to that madness. And then moving on to vocab, we're adding a bunch of verbs. And if you'll notice, there are a bunch of fun verbs that have weird stem endings. Like krazo, keruso, kathizo. I'm working from the bottom up. You'll see that a lot of these end with like zetas or kappas or gammas, and all of those are going to go to weird kind of amalgamated letters when they go into the future in the aorist. And so Long's introducing them now. They're all fairly common verbs, all things considered. Luo, also pathos. So we're finally getting luo, I lose and I untie. We're getting a couple new prepositions, epi and para, and both of them take 3 cases. So that's exciting. And so those will need to be memorized, and they're fairly common. Epi especially is fairly common. On or upon. Notice on fits the bill for all 3 cases. So that'll help. And then finally, we're learning a new verb, yuda, which is a special verb. Okay. Questions as we kind of wrap up this portion of the lecture, this portion of the conversation. Crystal clear, huh? Let me do, I'm going to pull up our classroom real quick so that you can see something. Okay. You all see our classroom? If you go down to the chapter 15, scroll all the way down to chapter 15. And you click on Greek paradigm chart, filled and blank. We'll do the filled out one. This is going to be overwhelming. I apologize, so please bear with me. This is what you'll know by the end of next week. Surprise. Okay. So a lot of this we already know. First and second declension nouns. We're going to add third declension nouns. We already have. So like the reality is we know most of this. We know these 2 charts. We know the present and the imperfect of me. We don't know the future yet. But we will. That's coming. We don't know the third declension nouns. We know the definite article down here. All that should be fairly familiar. So moving over to the indicative, and verb endings. I have these organized in type 1 to type 4. Do we see that? Okay. Type 1 and type 2 should look familiar. What I don't have here, so please listen to me. Please, like, dial in. If you're zoning out, dial in just for a brief moment. The type 2 endings that I have here are only the Omicron epsilon connecting vowel endings. They are not the alpha class endings. Okay? So if you don't listen to this and you just only use this chart and there's no problem solving that goes on, what will happen, and I promise you, is that you're going to see an alpha ending on one of those, a sigma alpha, and be like, I don't know what I'm looking at, because it doesn't match own. And so please understand that these are, 99% of the instances, or like the vast kind of the generality of the ending with the connecting vowels. Technically, those type 2 endings have an A class version connecting vowel. So if you wanted to add another column, you could do that. Like on the other side of the 4, you could do like 2 alpha or whatever and do those A class endings. I haven't done that because I'm trying to keep this as simplified as possible, but because it's simplified, it's non-exhaustive. So this goes back to if you've memorized aorist endings as type 2 endings, but with different connecting vowels, you'll be fine. In 5 of the 6 instances, the only one that's not is basically that first singular that where that own becomes just an alpha. Okay, so I don't know how you're going to memorize that, but again, I've tried to keep this chart as simplified as possible. I know I need to change it somehow. I just haven't figured out how I'm going to do that yet and keep it as simplified as it is. Anyways, but what I want to show you is the 3 charts below it, because this is a diagnostic tool that I created for my like working through endings, and it's been really, really helpful. So what you'll see is the endings at the top, and those are the ones that you filled out. Now, remember how I said you start at the end of a verb? Let's say that you hit a type 1 verb, a verb that has a type 1 ending. You go down the right-hand far column of the chart and you look for type 1 endings. You'll notice it only is present in the future. You see that? And then you move backwards and go, okay, what are the other differences? The only other difference is that sigma tense indicator. And so you can use these charts, if you memorize them, to help parse your verbs. Let's say we bump into a type 2 ending. Okay, you don't know two of these four, but we're just gonna you're gonna get thrown into the deep end now. We're gonna learn these here in the next week. But let's say you have type 2 endings. You'll notice that it's basically active. The only exception, and you really can't see this on the chart, which is really disappointing, because the pictures are in the way. Or no, you can. There you go. The type 2 endings are the imperfect, aorist, perfect, or pluperfect actives. Or if you go all the way down to the bottom, do you see this? It's also the aorist passive right here. So that type 2 ending, this is why, by the way, I don't like secondary active endings as the label for type 2, because it's not always active. Like, that's a problem if you've labeled it one thing and it's not always that thing. And so that's why I go with the type 1 to type 4. And also it makes writing this chart very quick when you're like sitting down, like if you are in a timed environment and you need to reproduce the chart. And there's a very clear pattern to the chart. I'll talk about that more next week. But basically, type 1s go to type 3s and type 2s go to type 4s. Except each time you move down a chart, you get one exception. So, like, for example, the present and the future are type 1s. When you move to the middle, they're type 3s. So if you'll notice, moving from the active to the middle, all the type 1s and type 2s go to type 3s and type 4s, with one exception, that being the perfect. The perfect actually goes to a type 3. And then moving to the passive, you'll see that the pattern stays the same, but one additional ending changes, and that's the aorist. That type 4 ending goes to a type 2. And so once you get this first, and then you'll notice that so if you get the active, the middle passive will often just kind of write itself, because all of the prefixes are the same. Things that go through stem changes are going to go through stem changes in all the voices. And the tense indicators for the perfect and pluperfect often drop off in the middle and the passive. And they change when they hit the passive, which is why we're not learning them now, because they have different tense indicators. So if I were you, I would probably start using this paradigm sheet and filling out what you know. You don't know everything. And again, you don't even need to fill out that definite article portion if you've memorized your definite articles, basically using your endings. So do anybody have any questions on this? Okay, awesome. Let's then stop that and let's pull up some exercises. It's amazing. The more I'm teaching, the better I'm feeling. Delete some of these real quick. Go ahead, and if you all need a quick potty break, I need to adjust this document. It has all my markups from the last time I used it. Really hope I'm feeling better tomorrow. Okay. Cool. Cool. Let me know when you all see that.
Got it.
I'll wait a minute for everybody to get back, and then we'll walk through it.
So Tom, is this paradigm chart? Do you still use this when you're?
I do.
Yeah.
Like, this is something that I have just sitting beside me when I sit down to translate Greek. When I want to practice, like I will still drill this paradigm chart. It's not exhaustive for everything for 502. Full elements added, but there's not a lot. Like, let me be very clear. Like, you add a couple elements in, you add a couple elements for 502, but you don't add a lot more than this.
Okay.
Like, you're still using this information quite a bit in 502. And so, yeah, so this is still my like kind of go-to resource.
Nice.
Yeah. It's something that, and I've had a lot of positive feedback from folks who've used it. Yeah. Has anybody been able to use the YouTube link that I've posted, or has it been causing problems? Okay. Sean was trying to use it and having some issues, so just trying to make sure that it's functioning. Okay. So normally we haven't been doing 10C, but I want to, or like the C sections of chapters, but I actually want us to do these because it's really thrown some folks for a loop when they do this section. But this is really like kind of the grammatical analysis that, like, this is where we're, I don't want to say this is where we're going. Like, we've done a lot of this already, but this is bringing together a lot of these grammatical categories. You remember on the first day I talked about your job basically is to know kind of 3 categories of information. The first of those being vocab, the second being paradigms, and the third being grammar. This is what that third bucket is. And I said, remember, it's like an amorphous kind of collection of just random facts of like what different pieces of knowledge, different words operating together end up meaning, like having special meaning or special implications in a sentence. And so like agency means, emphatic pronouns, ellipsis. This is when you would get to the end of 502 and into intermediate. This is where we move towards. This is what you spend, like it's kind of assumed that you know your endings. It's assumed that you know your vocab. And this is kind of what you're growing in from that point forward, is you're growing in the ability to read a Greek sentence and then to be able to talk about that Greek sentence. And talk about, like, you see agency here, and this hoti is functioning as a recitative hoti, and this one adjective is in a substantive position. We have a genitival emphasis, and yada, 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 yada. And it's basically doing a grammatical analysis of the Greek itself. And so this is our bucket of grammatical terms up until this point, and it's worth like acknowledging this is kind of where we're at. Oh, sorry, I forgot to grab my book. So for this first one, where do we start? What we're going to do is we're just going to do some translation. And then what we'll do after we do some translation is we're going to identify what we see like functioning here, or how we see things operating here. Okay? So for this first one, how do we want to mark this up? Like, where do we start when we go to markup?
Punctuation.
Punctuation. What punctuation do we see?
Period.
Period. No other punctuation significance. What else do we see?
Verb.
Yeah, there's no conjunctions. How about verbs?
No explicit verb.
There are in fact no verbs here either. So that's a thing. What do we identify after verbs?
Nominatives or subjects?
Yep. And do we have any nominatives?
Comatose.
Yeah, ho artos. A pretty obvious one. What else?
We have an adjective in the nominative form.
Yeah, we have a nominative adjective. Yep. Is that in any of our positions for adjectival positions?
Predicate.
Mm-hmm.
Does the predicate have the definite article? Yes, it does. It can or cannot. And so, again, I don't mean for that to be a trick question, but just simply to, like we need to be able to figure out if if we are looking at a predicate or not. And indeed, this is one of those options. And then, what is our genitive, or what's going on here? Yeah, Zoes is probably modifying this. Genitives normally sit after the things they modify. I wish people had told me that when I took Greek. Like, that was one of those revelations I learned, like, way late. And so I'd always see these genitives and be like, what is it modifying? And, like, I'd stress and consider all the options. No, normally if it's after a noun, it's modifying the noun it's after. Like, 95% of the time, that's the case. So, you just nip that in the bud just right out of the gate. Okay, so how are we going to translate something like this?
Is it ellipsis with you know what I mean?
Indeed. And so something like this, maybe? Now, is that how we translate predicate nominatives?
Probably not.
Do we remember how they function?
I mean, predicate nominatives are essentially equivocal clauses, aren't they?
They are. They are, but I would be careful because, for example, the bread of life is holy. Yeah, I mean, so Long has this as holy as the bread of life, and I'm trying to remember if word order was important in the chapter, and my brain's not functioning right now. And so that may be of significance. Regardless, what grammatical elements do we see here?
Ellipsis.
We do have ellipsis. So what we'll do is we'll just trying to click on the wrong thing. We'll mark EL in line in the translation after the ellipsis. You can do this a lot of different ways, but this is just how I'm going to do it. You can put it up here. What else do we have?
Predicate adjective.
And we have predicate adjective, indeed. That makes sense. How about let's go down to 5. Just wanna I'll let you guys do these, but so we may struggle with these. We may have to revisit them, like tomorrow, if you have questions after you've wrestled with these and trying to figure out what's what. But I want to also do number 5 real quick. So let's mark this up and then we'll figure out what we're looking at. Where do we start? Punctuation?
Punctuation.
What do we have for punctuation?
We have the period, but we also have the hoti after the speaking verb with the capitalization.
Yeah, so we have capitalization. You go back, you have a hoti or a comma, the verb of speaking. So we probably have the beginning of a quotation here. So probably a safe bet since we identified that hoti that's there. and the speaking verb, we may as well mark the rest of this up because we know what they are. Uni, and then ego is what?
I.
This first nominative pronoun. So we're going to translate this as what? It's using your new...
He was saying I am.
Yeah, he was saying I am. Okay. Or you might translate it I myself am. You wanted to kind of communicate that. The significance and of the presence of the ego. So what do you see here?
Is that emphatic pronoun?
Yeah, so we definitely have an emphatic pronoun here with the I. Then that's what we were trying to communicate with the myself here. Okay. Emphatic pronoun. What else?
Is it the recitative hoti?
Yeah, we have a recitative hoti, and that's basically, you'll notice that we didn't actually translate hoti as that, which is or because, it's not a content. You're not doing that. Basically, what's happening is this is becoming your punctuation here. What's the last one?
Direct discourse.
Yep, and there's direct discourse, indeed. And that's and the mere presence of the recitative hoti is denoting direct discourse. So this is kind of where we're going. This is the culmination of kind of all of your grammatical skills up until this point. And so if you kind of struggle with pulling all this stuff together, don't, it's not abnormal. This is new to you, and this is to be expected. And so, but spend some time and make sure you understand all these, what's going on. And if you have additional questions, we'll talk about it tomorrow. How's that sound? And then let's go down here let's just do a couple parsing of a couple verbs, just so we can get some practice. How about this first one? Where do we want to start with marking things off? What's the ending?
Own.
Own is our ending. And what else has been added to this?
Epsilon augment.
We have an epsilon augment up here. And so what I'll often do is draw lines in my verbs to help me portion off the pieces of the verb that are, to help me get to the stem, to get closer. And so what is my tense then?
Imperfect.
Yeah, we have an imperfect tense. And what's telling us that we're dealing with imperfect is we have a type 3 ending, or I'm sorry, type 2 ending. Brain's not working. With an epsilon historical augment on the front. You see how we got there? You started the, if you're using that chart, you find your type 2, look at what your type 2 options are, and then look to the front, and then that'll help narrow it down even further. So this is a imperfect tense. What's my voice if it's a type 2 ending?
Active.
It's an active, indeed. Why is this? It's active. What's my mood? Indicative, because the answer is always indicative. What's the person?
First or third?
Yeah, so this is first or third. It could be either. Context is what's going to help you out with that. And what is the number?
Singular or plural?
Plural. Yep. What is this coming from?
What verb?
Active.
Quaso.
Me.
Sorry, had to grab a power cord. Laptop's about to die.
Krazo.
Yes, Krazo. Yep. Sorry, I had to grab a power cord. Laptop's dying. Okay. Krazo, indeed. And I'm not going to write that out because reasons.
Even
How about this next one?
is that an Aorist?
Yeah, so how would you get there? What's the ending here?
Technically, the ending is just the epsilon, correct?
Well, technically, the ending is what would be here. Is that epsilon is the connecting valve. Yeah.
Yeah, the movable nu.
Yeah. The movable nu. Now, I mean, again, you don't need to, like, for parsing, as long as you know what you're looking at, you don't need to worry about, you don't need to mark that down. But yeah, so this is actually, as you noted, this is an aorist. Voice is what?
Active.
Indeed. And it is also a indicative, as are all of these. Person.
Third.
Yep, third singular. See how that works? And so, as we look down across these, without actually doing full parsing, you can begin to see, like when you get to this next one, you see this on ending. You see an eta at the front, which could imply a lengthening. You see that? And then you see this alpha class right here. And so you go, is there a sigma or potentially a sigma there? And you see there is potentially a sigma under C. And that's how I would advise going down all of these. Is just, sometimes you're going to bump into something like this, and you're going to be like, yeah, that doesn't work. That's just me. But for a lot of these, like, you're going to find the ending, and then once you've found the ending, you're going to look before it to see if, look in the beginning, nothing's been added. You don't have a vowel there. And then look to see if sigma's been added. And in fact, we do have one there. And you all can figure it out. It's just parsing. We'll do more of this tomorrow. And it's going to keep showing up again and again. So, any questions? I think we're going to wrap up pretty soon. Well, blessings on all of you as you learn the aorist tense. We'll, when like I said, I'm hoping I will be feeling better by tomorrow. And if so, then we'll pick up as normal. Looks like the weather should be getting a little bit better, hopefully, as well. Well, I will see you guys tomorrow. Blessings.
All right.
Hope he gets feeling better.
Yeah, thanks.